I grew up in a middle-class family in the suburbs of Boston. My childhood home was filled with warmth and laughter. I trusted my parents with everything, respected their guidance, and believed they would always have my back. That was until they kicked me out in the dead of winter, leaving me to sleep in my old car with nowhere else to go, all because I stood up against the lies poisoning our family. Before I tell you how I went from sleeping in my car to owning my parents' house, let me know where you are watching from, and hit that subscribe button if you believe family should never betray family. Growing up, our two-story colonial house on Maple Street was everything a kid could ask for. I had my own room decorated with basketball posters and shelves filled with science trophies. Every Sunday, my dad Harold would grill in the backyard while Mom Margaret prepared her famous potato salad. Those were simple but meaningful moments that shaped my understanding of family. From an early age, I learned the value of hard work. When I turned 16, I started working at the local grocery store after school. My parents taught me to save money and be responsible. I would stash away every extra dollar, building what I called my future fund. They seemed proud of my work ethic, often telling relatives how mature I was for my age. Dad worked as a construction manager, while Mom was an administrative assistant at the local high school. We were never rich, but we were comfortable. They paid for my brother Thomas' college education and promised to help with mine when the time came. I looked up to my dad, a stern but fair man who expected excellence, but celebrated even small achievements. Mom was the emotional backbone of our home, always ready with encouragement when school or life became challenging. When I graduated high school with honors and got accepted to State University for finance, I could see the pride in their eyes. That memory stayed with me during those freezing nights in my car, making the betrayal even more painful. Everything changed when the economy took a downturn. Dad was laid off from his construction management position after 15 years with the same company. Mom had to reduce her hours at the school due to budget cuts. I was halfway through college, working 2 part-time jobs while maintaining a 3.8 GPA in my finance program. The strain showed in their faces when I came home for weekend visits. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter. Hushed arguments echoed through the walls late at night. When I found Mom crying at the kitchen table one evening, she finally admitted they might lose the house if they could not make the mortgage payments. That night, I made a decision that I would later regret. I withdrew $15,000 from my savings account, nearly everything I had saved since I was 16, and gave it to them to help catch up on the mortgage. Dad initially refused, saying it was not my responsibility, but desperation eventually won out. They accepted the money with tears and promises to pay me back as soon as things improved. I trusted them completely. How could I not? They were my parents. Just when things seemed to stabilize, my older brother Thomas lost his job in Chicago. He and his wife Stephanie decided to move back home temporarily while they figured out their next steps. At first, it seemed like a good arrangement, having family around to support each other through difficult times. Thomas had always been the charismatic one, charming and quick with jokes. Stephanie had a way of making herself indispensable, cooking elaborate meals and reorganizing the house. But something felt off about their sudden willingness to move back to our small town after years of bragging about city life. Within weeks, I noticed concerning patterns. Neither Thomas nor Stephanie seemed particularly motivated to find new jobs. They slept until noon, spent afternoons watching television, and went out most evenings. Yet somehow, Stephanie always had new clothes, and Thomas had upgraded his phone. During one of my weekend visits from college, I overheard Stephanie talking to my mother in the kitchen. She was suggesting they consider selling the house, calling it too much maintenance for aging parents. She mentioned a smaller condo would be more practical. When I entered the room, the conversation abruptly changed. That evening, I checked the mail and found a credit card statement addressed to my father. Curious about our family financial situation, I opened it, discovering thousands in recent charges for restaurants, electronics, and clothing stores. The purchases aligned perfectly with items Thomas and Stephanie had recently acquired. That night, I confronted my brother in the garage while he was having a cigarette. I showed him the statement and asked if he had been using Dad's credit card without permission. His face twisted from shock to anger. Instead of denying it, he laughed and said it was none of my business. When I threatened to tell our parents, his demeanor darkened. Thomas walked back inside ahead of me. By the time I entered the living room, he was already telling a different story, accusing me of going through family financial documents to determine if I would get my $15,000 back. Stephanie joined in, painting me as money-obsessed and selfish. I watched in disbelief as my parents' expressions changed from confusion to disappointment. Despite my explanations, doubt had been planted. That night, for the first time, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Over the next few months, tensions escalated rapidly. Every weekend visit became more uncomfortable than the last. Stephanie had somehow positioned herself as my mother confidant, while Thomas and my father bonded over sports I had never cared about. I was becoming an outsider in my own family. One Saturday morning, I arrived to find Mom in distress. Her pearl necklace, a wedding anniversary gift from Dad, was missing. Stephanie was the first to suggest someone might have taken it, her eyes darting meaningfully in my direction. When Thomas mentioned he had seen me near Mom's jewelry box the previous weekend, a chill ran through me. They were setting me up. I denied the accusation vehemently, but could see uncertainty in my parents' eyes. Dad suggested we not jump to conclusions, but his tone lacked conviction. That night I slept poorly, feeling watched in my own home. The following morning, Stephanie emerged from her room holding the pearl necklace triumphantly. She claimed to have found it in the guest bathroom wrapped in a washcloth. My washcloth, the one with my university logo that I always packed for weekend visits. It was an obvious setup, but my protests fell on increasingly deaf ears. Mom wanted to believe me, but wavered under Stephanie's insistent whispers. Dad looked disappointed rather than suspicious of the too convenient discovery. That afternoon, while everyone was out shopping, I searched Thomas and Stephanie's room. Behind their dresser, I found a small lockbox. Using my pocket knife, I managed to open it and discovered several pieces of Mom jewelry along with cash and credit cards in my father's name. I took photos as evidence and waited for everyone to return. When I presented my findings at dinner, chaos erupted. Thomas lunged across the table at me, knocking over glasses and plates. Stephanie dissolved into dramatic tears, claiming I had planted the items. To my shock, Dad seemed more upset about me searching their room than about the stolen items. The argument escalated until we were all shouting. Years of resentment poured out as Thomas accused me of always being the perfect son, the favorite. Stephanie claimed I was jealous of their relationship. Through it all, Mom sat silently, tears streaming down her face. Finally, Dad slammed his fist on the table. He demanded to know why I was trying to tear the family apart with these accusations. When I reminded him about the $15,000 I had given them, he darkened further. That was the night everything shattered. Outside, snow was falling heavily, the January air bitter cold. Dad stood in the living room, face flushed with anger, and told me I needed to leave. Not just for the night, but permanently. He called me ungrateful, manipulative, and worst of all, not the son he thought he had raised. I looked to Mom for support, but she stared at the floor, silent tears falling. Thomas smirked from the doorway while Stephanie clutched his arm with false concern. Dad gave me 30 minutes to pack my essentials. In a daze, I stuffed clothing and important documents into my backpack and 2 duffel bags. As I carried them to my old Honda Civic, the snow soaked through my shoes. Mom watched from the window, but never came outside. Dad stood in the doorway, arms crossed, making sure I actually left. The first night in my car was surreal. I parked in the 24-hour grocery store lot, running the engine periodically for heat. I could not process what had happened. How could they believe? Thomas and Stephanie over me. How could they throw me out into a snowstorm? The days that followed were a blur of survival. I showered at the university gym, studied in the library until closing, and slept in my car with blankets I bought from Walmart. I picked up extra shifts at my campus job and started driving for a food delivery service at night. My friends Amanda and Jackson eventually realized something was wrong when I kept making excuses about not having them over. When I finally broke down and told them everything, they were horrified. They offered their couch on rotation, giving me blessed nights of warmth and real sleep. But I could not impose indefinitely. The betrayal cut deepest at night when I would lie awake, remembering all the times my parents had promised to always support me. The $15,000 was not just money, it represented years of trust and sacrifice. Now I had nothing, not even a home to return to on holidays. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after being kicked out, I ran into Frank Wilkins at the coffee shop near campus. Frank had been our neighbor for decades, a retired teacher who always brought over homemade bread at Christmas. His face lit up seeing me, then fell when I awkwardly explained I was no longer living at home. We sat down together, and Frank revealed things I had not known. My parents' financial situation was far worse than they had admitted. The house was 3 months behind on payments and headed for foreclosure. But more shocking was what he shared about Thomas and Stephanie. They had been overheard bragging to friends about how they were encouraging my parents to sell the house. Apparently, Stephanie had been pressuring Mom to liquidate assets to invest in some business opportunity Thomas had discovered. The same day I was kicked out, they had convinced my parents to make an appointment with a realtor. Frank looked at me with sad eyes and said, "Your brother and his wife are not good people, Kirk, and your parents are too blinded by his charm to see it. That house has been in your family for 30 years. It would break my heart to see them lose it because of manipulation." I thanked Frank for his honesty and walked back to my car with a mind racing with new information. The betrayal was even deeper than I had realized. They had not just chosen Thomas over me. They were being actively manipulated while their financial situation spiraled. That night, sleeping in the back seat of my Honda, I made a decision. I would not let my family lose everything to Thomas and Stephanie's schemes, even if they had thrown me away. I just needed to figure out how. The next 6 months were transformative. I doubled down on my studies, graduated a semester early with honors, and leveraged an internship into a full-time position at Westbrook Investment Partners, a boutique firm specializing in distressed properties. The salary was better than I had expected for an entry-level position, and the knowledge I gained was invaluable. While my career was taking off, I never forgot about my family situation. Through occasional texts with Frank, I learned the house had not yet been sold, but my parents were now facing imminent foreclosure. Thomas and Stephanie were still living there, still unemployed, still draining what little resources remained. My breakthrough came when I reconnected with Sarah Chen, a former classmate who now worked at Atlantic National Bank, the very institution that held my parents' mortgage. Over coffee, I carefully inquired about foreclosure processes, keeping my personal connection vague. Sarah explained that many foreclosed homes end up at auction, often selling well below market value. When I asked about a specific property without naming it, she looked it up in the system. With professional discretion, she confirmed a property on Maple Street was scheduled for auction in 3 months. This was my chance. The bank would rather recoup their investment than process a lengthy foreclosure. But I would need capital more than my entry-level salary could provide. I began working overtime, building a reputation for financial analysis while secretly developing a plan to save the family home, whether my family deserved it or not. Using knowledge from my finance degree and new professional experience, I created a detailed prospectus for purchasing and managing a residential property. Then I approached my friend Jackson, now working in legal services, to help me establish a limited liability company, Phoenix Properties, that could not be easily traced back to me. The final piece came when I presented my investment opportunity to Edward Davis, a senior partner at my firm known for mentoring promising analysts. After reviewing my proposal, Davis was impressed enough to become a silent partner, providing most of the capital while I contributed every dollar I had saved since being kicked out. The morning of the auction was crisp and clear, a beautiful September day that belied my churning stomach. I could not attend personally, too risky, someone might recognize me. Instead, Jackson represented Phoenix Properties, armed with our maximum bid and clear instructions. I paced my small apartment while waiting for news, jumping every time my phone vibrated. Finally, Jackson called. We won the auction at 20% below market value. The house where I grew up, where I had been betrayed and cast out, now legally belonged to me, or rather to Phoenix Properties. The next phase required careful handling. I hired Regional Property Management, a respected company, with no connection to me, to handle all communications with the current residents. They sent a formal letter to Harold and Margaret Wilson, informing them that their house had been purchased at auction, but offering a rental agreement, so they would not have to move immediately. The proposed rent was triple the previous mortgage payment, a number I knew would shock them, but that was still technically within market range for the neighborhood. The letter also stipulated that all current adult occupants would need to apply separately with proof of income, a requirement I knew Thomas and Stephanie could not meet. Through Frank, I learned about the chaos that followed. My parents were devastated but grateful for the rental option even at the inflated price. Thomas was furious, making multiple angry calls to the management company demanding better terms. Stephanie tried sweet-talking the property manager when he came for an inspection, only to be met with professional indifference. Within a month, Thomas and Stephanie moved out, unable to contribute to the high rent and unwilling to deal with the strict terms of the lease. They apparently found an apartment across town where Thomas finally took a job at an electronics store. For 3 months, I remained anonymous, watching from a distance as my parents struggled to make the rent payments. They both took on extra work, Dad doing weekend handyman jobs, and Mom picking up evening shifts at a local diner. According to Frank, they seemed humbled by their new circumstances. When I finally decided to reveal myself, I chose a Sunday afternoon. I asked the property manager to arrange a meeting with the tenants to discuss long-term arrangements. When I pulled up to my childhood home, my heart pounded so hard, I thought it might crack a rib. Dad opened the door, looking older and more tired than I remembered. When he recognized me, his face went through a rapid series of emotions, confusion, giving way to shock, and then something like fear. Mom appeared behind him and gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "May I come in?" I asked formally. "I believe we have some matters to discuss regarding your living situation." They stepped back, wordlessly, allowing me into the house that was now mine. The living room looked the same but felt different, smaller somehow. Mom kept staring as if she was seeing a ghost while Dad stood rigid with his arms crossed. "I guess you are wondering why I am here," I said, maintaining a professional demeanor despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm me. "I am the primary investor in Phoenix Properties, the company that now owns this house." Dad sank into his recliner, the same chair from which he had commanded me to leave 6 months earlier. "That is impossible," he said. "You do not have that kind of money." "I had $15,000 that you never repaid," I replied evenly. "And I made some excellent investment decisions after you taught me the value of self-reliance by kicking me out in the snow." Mom started crying, then silent tears tracking down her cheeks. "Is this revenge?" she whispered. "Are you going to evict us like we did to you?" I looked around the home where I had grown up, where I had once felt safe and loved, before answering. "No, I am not going to evict you, but we are going to have an honest conversation about what happened, and then we will discuss new terms for your continued residence here." We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where so many family meals had been shared in happier times. The afternoon sunlight streamed through windows that needed cleaning, casting long shadows across our faces as we began the difficult conversation. "I want to understand why you chose Thomas over me," I said, keeping my voice steady, despite the pain resurfacing. "Why you believed his lies without any evidence." Dad stared at his weathered hands before speaking. "We did not want to believe him, Kirk. But you were becoming so focused on the money you had given us. It seemed like you resented helping the family. I never asked for the money back until Thomas started stealing from you," I pointed out. "I gave it freely because I thought, that is what family does for each other." Mom reached across the table but stopped short of touching my hand. "Thomas and Stephanie, they were very convincing. They showed us texts they claimed you sent threatening to take legal action if we did not repay you immediately." I felt ice in my veins. "I never sent any texts like that." "We know that now," Dad admitted, his voice breaking. "We found Stephanie's phone with fake conversations she had created. By then you were gone, and we were too ashamed to reach out." The truth unfolded slowly, painfully. Thomas and Stephanie had systematically turned my parents against me, manufacturing evidence and playing on their financial fears. They had planned to convince my parents to sell the house, take the equity, and invest in a business scheme. Thomas was involved with one that later turned out to be fraudulent. When they discovered I had uncovered their theft, they accelerated their plan, forcing the confrontation that led to my expulsion. What they had not anticipated was the bank moving so quickly toward foreclosure or my return as the new owner. After all the facts were laid bare, I presented my terms. They could continue living in the house at a fair market rent, substantially lower than the initial rate I had set. They would need to make repairs and maintain the property, and I would inspect monthly. Most importantly, Thomas and Stephanie were not permitted on the property under any circumstances. Dad looked both relieved and ashamed. "It is more than we deserve," he said quietly. "This is not about what you deserve," I replied. "It is about what I choose to give. There is a difference." In the months that followed, I maintained professional distance while allowing a cautious rebuilding of trust. Mom would leave containers of homemade food on my doorstep with notes of apology and updates about their lives. Dad hired a financial advisor and began paying down their debts systematically. They both attended counseling to understand how they had been manipulated and why they had been so quick to turn on their own son. Meanwhile, I channeled my pain into purpose. The success of Phoenix Properties led to other investments, and within 2 years, I had a small portfolio of properties. I specifically looked for homes in foreclosure, where families might be helped with fair rental terms and financial guidance. Working with my friend Amanda, who had taken a job at a nonprofit, I established a small foundation, providing emergency housing assistance to college students facing homelessness. Every winter, I remembered those freezing nights in my car and funded hotel stays for students with nowhere to go during breaks. My relationship with my parents evolved into something new, not the blind trust of childhood, nor the bitter estrangement that followed my eviction. We established boundaries and expectations, communicating more honestly than ever before. They worked to earn back my trust through consistent actions rather than just apologies. The most unexpected development came from my professional success. The methods I had developed for identifying undervalued properties caught the attention of industry leaders. I was invited to speak at investment conferences and offered partnerships with established firms. The scared homeless student sleeping in his car had become a respected voice in real estate investment circles. One evening, nearly 3 years after the auction, I visited my parents for dinner. It was still strange to enter as a guest rather than a resident, but the atmosphere had gradually warmed. As we sat in the backyard, where Dad once grilled every Sunday, he handed me an envelope. Inside was a check for $15,000, along with a handwritten note. "This does not make up for what happened, but it is a start. We are proud of the man you have become despite us, rather than because of us." I looked at the check for a long moment before handing it back. "Keep it," I said. "Put it toward your retirement. I do not need it anymore." That money once represented everything I had worked for and saved. Now I understood its real value was in what it had taught me, not what it could buy. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover your true worth. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the journey from betrayal to rebuilding. The house I now owned was just a structure of wood and stone. The real property I had acquired was self-knowledge, the understanding that family is not just who raises you, but who stands by you when the cold winds blow. Sometimes the house you build after everything falls apart ends up stronger than the one you were forced to leave behind. Have you ever had to rebuild your life after betrayal? Let me know in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more journeys of resilience. Share with someone who might need to know they are not alone in their struggles. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, your lowest moment might just be the foundation of your greatest strength.